Uh, I'm I am born and brought up in Guwahati, Assam, and I did my schooling from here. Post my schooling, I completed my graduation. I did my BCom honors from NMIMS University, Mumbai, and 2 years I was in Mumbai. Third year was COVID, so I did my third year virtually there, virtually here in Guwahati itself. Post my graduation, I joined a family business of manufacturing paints. And since 1.5 years approximately, I've been engaged in the business. And while being in the business and even during college, ISB was always on the horizon. And the fact that I come from a family business background and I want to go into the PGP program is uh, it's a bit unusual for a lot of people. And I think personally it was a big advantage for me because I could actually showcase what I was able to achieve, what I was able to do. I got a lot of opportunities here too. And yeah, I think I applied for the early entry option for ISB. So I got an admit this year, but I'll be going next year, 2024. Yeah, that's it about it. I opted for the online interview. I was coincidentally in Chandigarh that day. I was traveling for work, but I did my interview online. I was staying with my sister, so I did it at her place. I made sure that I had a white background behind me, and my attire was proper formals, a shirt and a tie, and a blazer and half pants, since it was an online interview. Uh, my interview began actually not with a question; it began with an icebreaker. So, in all honesty, they could sense that even online, they could sense that I was a little unnerved, I was a little uneasy. So, they started off with an icebreaker. They asked me where I am, what am I doing. So, when I mentioned that I'm living with my sister in Chandigarh right now, they asked me about my sister, what she's doing, how do you find Chandigarh, have you been to the campus, and all that. Post that, I think they we directly went into the introductions. I mentioned my whole story, where I come from, what have I done, and yeah, we took it on further from there. My interview was mostly based around my work experience, the initiatives or the learnings that I had from my family business. So almost the entirety of the interview was surrounding this, not much about my academics or my college life. Uh, I wouldn't particularly say that I was caught off guard with any of the question, but uh, one thing that I could see that they were really paying attention to each and every word, and they were picking up from there, and they were further expanding into that. For example, uh, at one point they asked me what did I learn from, what are my biggest, some of the biggest learnings from my business, from my experience. So I mentioned patience, I mentioned negotiation, I mentioned team building, consensus building. They picked up patience and then they deep dive into it. Key, for example, patience, say, is a two-way sword that sometimes it helps, but too much patience is sometimes detrimental to the business. So this one particular question I thought was very peculiar and something that I was not very particularly prepared about. Other than that, I believe the preparation that I did with the interview prep that I did with the Preppie team, with Tadasmi sir, who is from Preppie, and post that, the mock interviews that I had, they covered almost everything. About 95% of my prep was covered. But yeah, I think that was one particular instance where I was really on my toes. Yeah. So talking in terms of preparing for the interview, I think the most critical was actually the application itself, which we prepared, the essays, uh, which again I took Preppy's help for the essay building process, for the profile building process, and then again for the interview prep. Once my application was solid, once I had submitted my essays, I made sure that before starting my prep for the interview, I had my story straight. For this, I believe Tadasmi sir from Preppie again was a great guide, was a great mentor for me. One of the first things that he told me to do was make an Excel sheet wherein you mention all the important events that you have had in life, what were your learnings from them, and what exactly the headings of what happened, the descriptions of what exactly happens, the granular details, and thirdly was all the learnings that I had. So initially, I couldn't figure the purpose of this particular exercise, but later, further down the line, uh, during the interview process, or while preparing for specific questions of the interview, this particular Excel came in very handy. I had a snapshot of my whole life in front of me, and ISB's interview is mostly about us, about talking about our experiences, not exactly very solid credentials or theoretical, but about how we are as a person. And that particular Excel had a snapshot of how I am as a person, how I viewed myself. There were two benefits. Number one, I could really helped me introspect. The preparation of the particular sheet in itself took me about 2 3 days, and there were learnings that at the moment of that event happening I did not take into account, but I could see how that shaped me, how that brought me to where I am. And secondly, while actually preparing content for the interview, these particular stories, these particular events came in very handy. Uh, Post that, I believe there were different categories uh, that I tackled. Say, for example, my personal credentials, my work experience, my college experience, my short term and long term goals. So these were very broad categories, and in each of these categories, there were specific questions which I prepared. And again, the interview prep which I had with Preppy was very helpful because I could really break down the questions and the categories more effectively. I could tackle each of them properly, and I could actually make pointers out of what I am supposed to say. Post that, when the interview prep was done, I started with our mock interviews. So I actually took two mock interviews from Preppy, two-on-one interviews, which were very great, which were very helpful. Um, the panelists were the ones who actually had taken interview in the past too. One of my interviews was very soft and gentle, not very grueling, but the second one was very, very grueling. So I got a taste of both sort of scenarios that I could be in. And yes, I think a culmination of all these three, the two mocks and the interview prep, it really helped me uh, put forth and achieve what I wanted to in the actual interview. People can easily, even if a layman goes to the website and talk to a few people, they can easily figure out the strong credentials, the diverse background prep from which Preppy's team is coming from. So I think that in itself is a very big advantage. For example, I mentioned in my application and in my initial discussions that my short-term goal was to work in the real estate or infrastructure industry. So Preppy assigned me with someone who already had a lot of experience with in the infrastructure industry, number one, and someone who was already in the interview panel of ISB itself, number two. Number three, someone who had already dealt with aspirants who came from a family business background. So I think Tadasmi sir again was a perfect combination of all these three. And he could really hit on the points, the issues that I had or the biases that I had. He could really hit on them. And the sort of clarity that he gave me was very critical. And I think this this clarity that I got was actually a product of the process which Preppy has at its back end of mapping each candidate to the proper counselor or to the proper mentor. So I believe That is a very big advantage of Preppy. Secondly, affordability. That goes without saying. And thirdly, I believe uh, the ease of communication which I had with Preppy's team. So what happens is when it's admission season, like right before 1 or 2 months before the deadline, everything and everyone becomes very hectic. But this was one problem that I did not face with Preppy. Communications with the team was very smooth. With my mentor was very smooth regarding interview prep, application prep, or say mock interviews. And even Preppy's team was very flexible with my timings. So yeah, I think these are some of the advantages that Preppy had. So my interview began with my own introductions, and we deep dived into our business, into my work experience post that. So the only question that I asked at the end of my interview to the panels was, uh, "My interview is done. It was a great experience, but I would like to know more about them, about where they come from, what's their background." So coincidentally, even one of the panelists was engaged in some capacity in their own family business, besides being a working professional. And the other panelist was a product manager for Zomato. So yeah, I think the note on which I was able to end, it was very personalized. It really helped me connect with whom I was talking to. And yeah, I think I refrained from asking very technical questions because I believe those can be answered even from other sources. It's in these interviews, it's very important to build a rapport with your interviewer. So I chose the path of asking them these personal questions and figuring out who they are as a person. Uh, Throughout the interview, there were a lot of questions that the interview panel asked me. So my interview was about half an hour, 29 minutes to be exact. And it was, as I mentioned, almost the entirety of the interview was surrounding my work experience. So initially, I mentioned a few initiatives that I took in our business. So they picked on from those initiatives, and then they asked me specific details of how you actually went about taking these initiatives. What was the planning involved? What did you learn from them? And when I mentioned what I learned from them, they again picked it up. For example, the example that I mentioned, that one of my learnings was patience. So they picked up patience and they put a hypothetical situation in front of me, that patience is a two-way sword. What happens if A happens, B does not happen? What happens if you are too patient and you lose out on an opportunity? So I could actually bring in specific examples from my own work experience of where patience has helped me and where patience has failed me. Besides that, I believe a lot of it, the interview was very gentle. They were very friendly. They were not grueling at any point. They were trying to understand me. They were trying to understand more about my knowledge, what sort of knowledge I have, and what sort of learning I gain. And towards the end, I believe uh, we talked about one of the skills that I picked up from our business. We talked in length about how negotiation as a skill is very important. Now, this is something that I had already prepared with Preppy of how to tackle this when I come across that what was your most critical learning from the business. So I could confidently talk about this one point on negotiation, and I could plug in how ISB is actually gonna help me hone my negotiation skills and help me better the skills that I already have acquired and help me share these with my cohort also. So yeah, I think the interview ended on a good note. And after that, I asked them questions about themselves, and yeah, that's it. My first thought was it could have been better, much, much better, because I realized that at a lot of places I fumbled, I was repetitive. I had my story straight. I was trying to stick to a structure as much as possible. But I genuinely thought that it could have been better. But by God's grace, the result was good. Yeah. Looking back, I believe there were one or two very critical points where I did not prepare as such, which were supposed to be, common areas. So my one recommendation for anyone who's going to be taking reference from this video would be to get the basics all out at once, 100%. I got 95% of my basics right, and the 5% I sort of ignored, which was very wrong of me. And I got lucky that they did not come up in the interview. I am confident that I would have been able to take them up instantaneously, but I still believe that, preparing 100% of the basics itself is very important. And besides that, I don't think I would have done anything else differently. Uh, the reason for me not choosing an offline interview was also a very tactical one, which also I believe worked in my advantage, given the sort of profile and the GMAT score that I had. I came to the conclusion that, an online interview should be good enough for me. I did not have to take the risk of going out to another city for an offline interview, where there are all sorts of pressures. You are traveling, there are a lot of people there, and uh, your body movements, your body image becomes one of the most critical factors along with what you're seeing, which sort of gets downsized in an online interview. So yeah, I think these are some of the things that I kept in mind.